Are you ready? Let's go. Ready?
Ready.
Yeah, ready when you are.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Holden Shepherd, Heidi Anderson, Jan Latter, Alison Patterson, welcome to my little show.
Why do you call it a little chat show?
Jan Nichols, Sam Eichen, Annabelle Smith, Donna Mazza, Rebecca Watson, Jonelle Fraser, Tracy Jacobson, Adam Wallace, Monique Mulligan, Matt Glover, Karen Young. I don't even know where I'm going with this. Welcome to my show. Now, before we meet our guest, Inspiring Kids Home Edition is now available. Now, this is the Inspiring Kids course that I've designed specifically for kids with autism, with ADHD, dyslexia, learning difficulties, anxiety, disability. It's designed for these kids to feel okay about who they are. This is that big self-acceptance thing that is so important, because there's nothing out there that kids can watch, like a program or anything like that, that says directly, hey, you are amazing just the way you are. You are fantastic and you are an amazing human being. That's what this program does. Plus, that's module 1, module 2, 3, and 4 goes through emotional regulation, so to manage those big emotions like anxiety or anger, and talk about encouraging empathy, resilience, and obviously creativity. So, Inspiring Kids Home Edition is now available, and I'm realizing even in homeschooling communities, there's a big gap, because you can call it the social and emotional learning for homeschooling communities. It is now available. So just go to my website down here and take a look around, and this will be, I think, play a big role and make a big difference to the lives of many, many, many kids. Okay, let's meet our guest for today. We're talking to Barry Nichols, the author of Second Innings on Men, Mental Health and Cricket. Now, Barry used to work for the ABC, full disclosure. He used to interview me all the time, get me on the show to talk about different things, kids' books, ghosts and all that sort of stuff. Now I've got the pleasure of talking to Barry, because this is a memoir of his life growing up, but it's got his present, but it's past, it's swaps between the two. But it's such an important discussion about mental health, anxiety, depression, and how it can pass through the generations and how it's affected Barry. So this is such an important conversation about men and mental health in general that we all need to be having. And so Barry and I have just had such a great in-depth conversation where we've gone to some really interesting places. And I really, 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 really hope you enjoy this interview too, and it helps you in some way to not feel so alone. If you've got anxiety or mental health issues, or you're just troubled by something, please enjoy this interview. So, cup of coffee, glass of wine, whatever it is, walking the dog, mowing the cat or something, I don't know, whatever it is. Let's get to know Barry Nichols. Barry Nichols, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Well, I'm very well, thank you. After a rather turbulent year, it's nice to be settled and in a nice bit of accommodation near the ocean. And yeah, life's looking pretty good.
Yeah, you're in a pretty good part of the world down in Busso, overlooking the ocean. I'm very envious, but then again, I've got my own rural property out here, Barry.
Yeah.
Surrounded by bush and birds and all that sort of stuff. And but we're not here to talk about nature, are we? We're here to talk. I'm actually, I must admit, I've got to tell everyone, people watching, normally it's the other way around. Barry is the one interviewing me, because Barry, many years on the ABC, would always ring me up and say, Josh, can we talk about either kids' books, ghosts, or other strange things? And so now I'm interviewing you, Barry, and I'm a little nervous. So you'll be giving me a score out of 10 at the end?
Yeah, well, happy to do that, of course. I'm sure it'll be very high.
Let's talk about Second Innings. Now,
yes,
I absolutely loved this book. It is so raw, it is so honest, and it goes into a lot of obviously personal spaces for you. Out through Fremantle Press. I was going to ask you, how do you feel about anxiety, depression, once you wrote it? How do you feel about that now?
Oh, that period in my life,
Yeah.
or just
Or
yeah.
how did writing the book help you understand it better?
Oh, okay. Well,
Mm.
it made me come to a greater understanding of my family's history of at times poor mental health. You can sort of trace it back through, if you go back to your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, you can see there's some sort of, it may not have been categorized or diagnosed as poor mental health, but you can see in some of the behaviors that there is like a line that does exist. I suppose it's like for any health matter, there are predispositions that exist. One of the most fascinating elements of that was looking at my grandfathers, who I didn't meet either of them, but I was able to find out about their lives. And they were two guys who'd spent almost 4 years during World War One, basically on and off the front for that whole period. And their lives were pretty well destroyed by the First World War. Yep. And they came back and they died. They died pretty young. They were in their early 60s when they died, but it really affected their lives and their relationships, I think, with their children, who were my parents. And I think some of that got carried on through the generations. So something I learned from writing this book was a more intricate detail of family history of mental health. And also some of the major traumas in life that I'm sure were the driving forces behind some of the eruptions that occurred. I mean, I describe mental health in the book as like an underwater stream that occasionally bursts to the surface. And I think
that's a good description. I really relate to that. Now, I want to circle back into the intergenerational trauma in a minute, because I think that is really important to actually just explore a little bit more, and also the how anxiety can be modeled as well from parent to child, which is another thing. But firstly, just the thumbnail sketch. I know you briefly touched on it there. What's the book about?
So essentially, it's about it was set in two time frames, but it's about a period of poor mental health that I had between 2014 to 2016. That was just kicked off. The catalyst was a bit of a health issue, but the sort of the reality of it was I was probably trying to do too much at the time. So it's a description, and the book is really set in alternating time frames. So there's the period, this 2014 to 16 period, where I was going through this difficulty. And I then go back to telling stories about my grandparents, and then my parents. And then when I came along in the early 60s, and our family together with my three brothers and I and my two parents growing up through that period in the 70s and 80s. So it sort of flips back and forth a bit.
Where'd you go? Why'd you do it that way? Where'd you come up with that idea?
Well, that's a good question. I was really struggling with writing this book. I had the basics for it. I had some of the stories, but I really didn't have an architecture to it or a structure. And what I did was I sent some of the book to a former chief of staff of mine, a guy called Glenn Morrison, when I worked at the Centralian Advocate in Alice Springs. He was the first senior reporter, then the chief of staff. And he read it and he said, look, I like some of this, but you're going to have to set it in alternating timeframes. And it was like having a light switched on in a room, So all of a sudden I had a way of structuring the narrative where I could tell my stories in a way that was that made sense, I suppose, and gave it a real structure that I thought was pretty solid. So that was the reason. That was a major turning point for it.
I was going to say, because normally memoirs are usually just linear from beginning to end, and like this happened and that happened and all that. But I really like that concept of shifting the timeframes and jumping, because that allowed you, or the reader, to go, okay, well, how is this modern bit connected with the past bit? And you're able to do that, and that's tell the story in a different way. And I suppose, so for someone who is writing a memoir, having that revelation, someone outside going, why don't you do it this way? You said that was a game changer. So what kind of advice would you give to someone writing a memoir to get a different perspective on it if they're stuck?
Well, I'd have to read it, I think, to get a sense of the direction of it. And I'll ponder that while I tell you this story. And that is that once I had that advice of setting it in 2 time frames, I wrote it pretty well in 6 weeks.
Wow.
I just sat down and wrote it, but it took a while to refine it, but I got the bulk of it down in 6 weeks. The advice in terms of that I'd give to people writing a memoir is to tell it in stories. You know how sometimes you read family histories, just sort of what a memoir is in a way, and you can see that it's just a chronological thing that is not that enlivening. I think it's you tell a narrative needs stories that are connected in some way. Now, that's one way of connecting them through timeframes. I suppose another way could be thematic.
Yeah.
So it doesn't always have to be the back and forth. It just depends on the memoir and the style of writing.
But it's the little collections of scenes strung together. It's not, and I think that's I've done a lot of reading on memoir because I'm trying to write my own at the moment, Barry, and that's hence why I'm asking for a bit of advice here on behalf of everyone else. But it is, it is trying to understand that it's not just I went here and this, because I know that, because when they say use stories, like pick a scene from your childhood and write about that scene, how it made you feel, all that sort of stuff. But a lot of people who've suffered trauma have trouble isolating particular scenes from, because sometimes it ends up just being a big blur, and you can't just write, well, my childhood was a big blur, the end. So it's like, because you've got so many amazing scenes in there, these moments from your childhood. How did you go picking the important ones? Which ones stood out? How did you pick them?
Well, that was, I suppose it got to the point where, ultimately I had a lot more stories than what I included in the end. So I had to work out on a whole lot of levels which stories would go in, which ones wouldn't, and it depended on, readability. It also depended on impact on people. I mean, that was something I was very nervous about, because writing a memoir that's pretty confronting and deals with issues that are quite sensitive. It's very difficult to work out what to finally include in it. That's what people used to. Some of my friends who've read the book say, "Gee, that must have been hard living through that." And I said that sorry, it must have been hard writing that book, writing your book down. I said it was a lot harder living through it. The writing was relatively easy.
You bring up 2 points. First point is, how did you know you were going to be in a safe space to write it without being re-traumatized?
Well, I didn't really. I just wrote it. I suppose by the fact that I felt comfortable writing it meant that I was okay with it. So, I mean, these were things that have been kicking around in my head for years. Yeah. And it just came out. This book was always...
Was it almost like a bit of therapy, writing it? I know that sounds a cliche, but...
Yeah, not really. I think it was just a matter of, I wanted to tell a story, and I write. So, and I mean, there are a couple of things that happened along the way that were sad but fortuitous. And by that, I mean that during the period that I'd written the bulk of the book, and my father, who was 92, had gone into care, and then he died. which was, very sad for all of us. But it meant that I was able to access some of his family archives and documents that I hadn't either I hadn't seen before or I hadn't seen in a long time. And that helped me corroborate some of the stories in the book.
Yep.
So that was, that was a pretty important, while very sad, it was an important, they were important archives for me to get hold of, particularly when it came to my father's father and his experiences in the First World War and ultimately his early end. So,
because they
also gave me a bit of an insight.
What was it? They used to call it shell shock back in World War I and World War II. That the guys would come home with shell shock, and which was now later they would call it PTSD, and then totally undiagnosed, not treated, and the blokes would always withdraw into themselves. They would carry that PTSD, the trauma of the war, with them, and that because my grandpop, my mum's father, he was in World War II, and he came back a completely changed person, completely and utterly changed, and just could not communicate to his kids. And so here's my mum, all of, so young, she was just trying to connect with her father, and she couldn't connect with him, and he couldn't connect with her, and so everyone loses these really important connections, and the blokes have got nowhere to get help, and then that trauma gets passed down to the kids, and then their kids and their kids, and that's the intergenerational trauma that you speak of, and that is really openly discussed nowadays, which is great, which is finally it's been talked about.
Well, it is. I think it needs to be talked about a bit more. I mean, there is talk of intergenerational trauma, but you don't hear so much of it being discussed with war veterans. I mean, you're starting to hear of it, but it is. I mean, my father used to just go out of the house, so he didn't see his father on most days. And they always had to be quiet around the house. There was really no sense of fun for my dad, and I think it was pretty similar for my mother. And the grandmothers used to say, "Oh, they were never the same once they came back from the war," and they never talked about it either. They would never talk about their experiences.
God no, and that's why it just. Having it all bottled up and not being able to talk and not being able to feel safe, not being able to have any of that connection, that's got to have an effect. And you look at what isn't the government meant to be doing an inquiry into veteran suicides at the moment? And it's like, hello, it doesn't take a genius to work out what's going on. It doesn't need an inquiry. But anyway, which is needed. But the trauma, that's the thing, the trauma of that and the resulting effect on the children and then the grandchildren, it's got to be taken into account. And then next thing you've got the whole bunch of people with anxiety and depression and going, well, where did that all come from? Well, hello, you can look back and see where it comes from. And that's basically what you're highlighting in Second Innings.
Yeah. Well, my parents had a very tumultuous marriage, and they had four kids in quite a short period of time. My parents didn't get a lot of support from their own parents, it was my mum on her own looking after four young kids, my dad going out to work every day at weapons research establishment. So they were probably like a lot of families in that way, but of that era. But you have, both of them, I'm certain. I mean, my mother certainly suffered from a lot of anxiety, and you put them together and they were like dynamite. My parents, I was giving a talk the other day, and I said, my three brothers and I got into the habit of eating very quickly, because we didn't want to be around the dinner table very long, because that was like the epicenter when it came to arguments, because that was like enforced engagement between my parents.
I know I shouldn't be laughing at that, but
Yeah, it was bloody hard. And it was, my dad, who had a sense of the understatement, it was the equivalent of Richie Benno. He used to describe the marriage in later years as not ideal. But the fact that traumatized 4 children, and it really affected my eldest brother, Stephen. It probably affected him the most, I think. Although it's all dependent on genetics and other factors as well. Yeah. But I mean, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was about 21.
And that had a really big effect on your family too, didn't it?
Yeah. So, and he was very ill for 2 decades, really. And that caused, well, by then my parents had divorced, but it caused enormous trauma for everyone. If you've got someone who's periodically psychotic, and the mental health system, people criticize it now, but you should have seen it in the 80s. It was pretty poor.
I know.
So, if you've got someone who's desperately in need of help and you can't get it for them, it's an odd feeling. It's very anxiety-inducing on a whole range of fronts, but also it has that thing where you've got no control over it. You sense there's this situation where you just can't have an influence on, and you're trying to help, but you can't do anything.
Yeah, so. No, I agree. And that's an interesting insight, because as a kid growing up, my parents were exactly the same. And that's why reading your book, a little trigger warning, like, holy hell, Jesus, just bringing back some memories. Great. Thanks, Barry. But it's true that the explosive relationship that my parents had, and when they divorced when I was 12, it was like, oh, thank God for that. It's like suddenly you could have a little bit of peace in the house, and you can, until Dad got the girlfriend in and all that sort of stuff. But my mum's sister was schizophrenic, or is, she's still around, and but just watching that and how to get treatment for her, and growing up as a kid with my auntie who's got schizophrenia, and just watching the whole mental health system was really, it wasn't that adequate back in the 80s and even in the 90s. I think it's a lot better now, but really traumatic for everyone.
Yeah, I think it is better now, but there's still a long way to go. I mean, one of the things that my brother Steve, so my eldest brother, who had such poor mental health, he's better now. He's essentially on tablets that have stabilized him, but the problem is that he sort of sleeps a lot because of the tablets. But he went through a horrific time over decades. And it was just like kicking a can down a road to try and get help. Like you would, there are times he needed to be hospitalized, and the times we could get him into hospital, he'd be out in 2 days, and he'd just come out and he'd be pissed off that people had put him in hospital. I tell a story in the book how on Christmas Day 1984, or the week leading up to that, he was going through a period of psychosis, and he said to me, "Oh, mental illness is the bargain basement of discrimination," which is a pretty it's a pretty strong.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I thought so, and particularly when someone's in the middle of a psychotic episode. I mean, he thought Kalgoorlie was going to get not Kalgoorlie, South Australia was going to get a nuclear bomb dropped on it. So on Christmas Day, he went out to buy a packet of cigarettes, and he ended up driving to Kalgoorlie. He was that concerned that a nuclear bomb was going to be. Up to that, where he was very unwell, and you sometimes find this with people who are severely unwell, is that you can talk to them and they appear as if everything is fine, and they are lucid, and everything seems great. And then 2 minutes later, they're talking about South Australia being nuked by a bomb.
Yeah.
So Steve, in the middle of that psychosis, was able to come out with that line that mental illness is the bargain basement of discrimination. And that comes onto the point of stigma, which I think is continually a real problem. And it's better than what it was in the 80s, but I think for people who have severe ongoing mental health issues, that stigma is still very strong.
I suppose it's just people don't know how to cope. They don't know how to react. They don't know what to do. And we haven't been informed of how do you interact? How do you deal with, people with severe mental illness and stuff?
Yeah.
It's just like, they've been institutionalized for so long, you go, well, shunned away. But that leads me into, anxiety, depression, especially men's mental health. And I obviously know you're a big advocate for men's mental health. How do you think we're going as a society with that?
Not very well with men's mental health.
Yeah, but you've got, I'm going to say you've got your Black Dog Institute, you've got Are You OK Day, you've got all these sort of lots of organisations out there. There's millions of dollars being poured into the awareness campaigns and stuff. That's got to be helping in some way.
Oh, I'm sure, I'm sure anything that brings people together is helpful. I think being isolated is probably one of the worst things that can happen to someone who's going through a really difficult stage. But I just don't think, more generally speaking, and this is across the country, that there is the resourcing for mental health that there needs to be.
Because I know there's a huge, at the moment, due to COVID and all that, there's a massive wait list to see a psychologist or a counsellor. Massive wait, say if you want to get your child in to see a psychologist, the wait list could be 6 months to a year. Yeah, right.
Well, see, that just means there's not enough resourcing for it. If you're having to wait, and this is a matter of importance. It's not like it's something that can be continually put off. And I mean, the contradiction for me is that most people either experience a degree of poor mental health throughout their life at some stage, or know someone who has, and yet we still have this stigma attached to mental health. And I think that until there's greater resourcing and greater acknowledgement of to help people who've got mental health issues or concerns, then stigma is going to continue to be at the level it is. Because when you don't resource something properly, you're saying you don't value it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Dave, have you seen or come across any programs or anything that you go, hey, that's good, that's working?
Well, I mean, not specifically. In my case, I was able to access a very good doctor and a very good psychiatrist, and I was able to access both of those people in a relatively short time frame. And I was able to have ongoing contact with them, and they were incredibly supportive and compassionate, and they weren't going to give up. They were just, and they were level-headed and just and really intelligent and able to explain to me what was going on. It was Dr. Goria in Busselton, Dr. Best, who was in Busselton then, but he does a fly out of Derby now, I think. But they were magnificent. And it really struck home to me the significance of getting a good GP. You get a good GP who gets to know you and understands you, you're going to be in much better shape.
And that can be difficult because, like, a lot of places, the GPs rotate because it's like if it's like an industrial strength GP clinic with 20 or 30 GPs there, and people just come and go all the time. So I know from my own personal experience, trying to have by the time I got to see a GP for my own mental health plan, I'd already got a little bit of a trust up with him. And I went, okay, I trust him.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up and I'm going to say exactly what I've been feeling. And that is such a relief. And of course, he then left. And it's like, right, I've got to start that whole process all again.
Yeah.
And I can see why people just end up going, I can't be bothered, because it's like you got to go see another psychologist and you go, I've got to tell the whole story again. And it's, but I'm interested in the cost factor. Some people are able to afford it because, but other people who can't afford it or on low incomes, and they're sometimes the people who need the help the most. What can we do to help this discrepancy? This is what I want to know.
Well, I think there is support out there for people. My experience was I went to the GP who got me straight to a psychiatrist, and that was under the public health system.
Yeah.
So, the cost was minimal there.
Okay, well, that's all right. Yeah.
There are a couple of times I went to a psychologist, and that was costly. For me personally, and I think it's very much what suits you. I didn't, I was so wired and anxious at some stages that going to a psychologist, while their advice was very good, I couldn't take it in. I wasn't in it. I didn't have a state of mind to take it in. So I needed, ultimately I needed some medication, as my doctor said, to cool my brain down. And that's what, got things back into perspective for me. So, from my experience, I was lucky, but also I didn't go down the path of a psychologist for a longer period of time. But I think the cost of it is problematic. And again, it comes to resourcing. I think that if there's greater resourcing or subsidising of psychologist costs, then it'll bring bring more people to come out and attend. Here's a cricket quote for you, Josh, because I know how much you love the game.
I do like cricket. I got no idea what's happening with the cricket now, except the scandals. But anyway.
Oh yeah, we won't go there. So at the start of I've been doing a few talks about the book, and at the start of each talk, I pose a question to the audience that they, at the end of the talk, they then find out the answer to. And there was, so I'll provide the question, but not the answer, in case someone who's watching this might go to one of my talks. So the question is, there was a famous cricketer who once said that if we didn't have the game of cricket, there would be an even greater need for psychiatrists in the world. So,
okay, I like that. And I'm not meant to guess who said it.
Well, you can.
I got no idea. Is it in here?
That's good.
Is it in here?
No.
Is the answer in here? Oh, okay. Now, can I just read? There's one little. I'm going to do a little book reading here, Barry. There's one.
Good. Yeah, because you're better at it than I am. Seriously.
There's one little bit here. I used to hate reading aloud as a kid. I'll be the one going, no, don't pick me, don't pick me. I really wanted to share this bit because every time I read it, I choke up a little bit because I relate to it so much.
All right.
And so the scene is that you're at the footy with your dad. I don't know, how old were you?
11, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you go off and listen to the coach talk to the team halfway through, and your dad is giving you directions on how to get back, but you completely ignore him and you get lost. And so you're in a massive crowd at the footy, you're 11, you're lost, and then you end up being found by someone and your dad finds you again and all that sort of stuff. And then you say the sentence that really gets me is that I am reunited with dad, but the sense of being hopelessly lost stays with me forever, lost with no landmarks to guide me back. Oh my
Mm.
God. But it's that we've been hopelessly lost stays with me forever. Is that still with you?
Oh, yeah, that feeling.
Mm.
Yeah, it certainly came back to me in 2014 to 16 when I was going through that difficult period. And that's
Yeah.
part of the problem. If you are in a really deep state of anxiety, your thinking narrows to the point where you can't work out what the hell to do next to get out. So you just keep going back to this recurring worry as opposed to trying to think logically about something. But yeah, that's a feeling. It's amazing the sort of the feelings that can be ignited when you remember back to a particular time or incident. And yeah, I had great. I still remember the girl who found me wandering around, and how kind she was.
Because she gave you an ice cream.
She was only. Yeah, she's only young. She would have only been, I don't know, 18 or 19, but she could see a kid in distress. And so.
Wow, I love it. Now, we're going to end on a really high note. I want to know, Barry, what lights you up?
What lights me up? What do I enjoy doing?
Yeah, like when you think about something, what brings you that joy, that really good feeling?
Going down the beach and swimming. That gives me a great feeling. Seeing my kids, obviously, that's the most. Seeing my children, that lights me up the most. Reading a good book, just getting into that. You know, when you're really you've escaped into a book, or you're completely fully into it and reading it and lost in the story. Yeah, those are the things that I really enjoy.
Okay, sounds pretty good, Barry. Now, people can go and get Second Innings from the nearest bookshop, out by Fremantle Press.
So. Yeah,
we'll make sure it's in all the good bookshops, Barry.
It is pretty widely available.
Yeah, I think it is too, actually. Or just go to the Fremantle Press website, which is fremantlepress.com.au. Thank you so much for joining me, Barry, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.